The Clerk of Tynwald's office is calling for interested parties to apply for a new role, the Tynwald Auditor General. The estimated budget for the appointment and their associated office is around $400,000, so how can this be justified at a time of financial constraint? Juan Watterson has long been an advocate for introducing this role, and he explains all on tonight's show. He also talks about that little spat about committees he had with Laurie Hooper. Can we afford to spend $400,000 to save at least $1.2 million? Indeed, can we afford not to? I suppose to start with, it would be interesting to know a little bit about this new appointment. Was it the Tynwald Auditor General? It seems, I would imagine to many people, that this is a large expense, and surely this is just doing the job that MHK should be doing anyway in scrutinising the finances and financial affairs of government.
Well, as you know, I've been a strong proponent of this office for some time and been looking forward to seeing it come to fruition, and the job is out for advertisement at the moment, so is able to take applications. One of the key points about this job that has sold it to Tynwald is that we expect this person to make 3 times their salary in savings within 3 years. So it's got a real sense of value for money driven outcome associated with this role. That's not like most of the public sector roles, and there's a review in there, so if this isn't working out, but I suspect that with a £1.2 billion Manx budget and spending £100,000 on their salary, I would be amazed if we couldn't find those sort of multiples of savings. Yes, you could argue that this is the job of MHKs to do, but MHKs are straight in off the street, very little training given to them, so this is someone who will have a track record of value for money, a track record of financial experience, and we'd expect them to hit the ground running, set the office up and start delivering on those multiples of savings and good governance, which will report direct to Tynwald rather than be someone who's responding to government. And again, that independence of thought, independence of mind is a key characteristic of the role, which is shared by just about every country in the Commonwealth. This is a part of those institutions of good government.
And of course, as you say then, most parliaments have the equivalent of a Tynwald Auditor General.
It's a very small list of ones that don't around the world, and they're not normally the sort of company you'd like to keep. I think North Korea, a couple of the stands didn't have one, but actually this is something that's an internationally recognised benchmark for good governance.
And of course, committees presumably will be able to work with the Tynwald Auditor General when they're in post. Presumably, a committee could refer a matter to the Tynwald Auditor General. It
could do, but the important thing is that they're in charge of their own work programme. They can't just be deluged by lots of other people and be instructed by anybody. So again, that independence of the role is absolutely critical in making sure that it works. The key relationship will be with the Public Accounts Committee, but yes, anyone, not just within the committee system, anyone in Tynwald, anyone member of the public could refer matters to them where they can see waste, inefficiency, savings that could be made, and it would be up to that office holder though to prioritise those and to work out what they're going to report on to Tynwald in due course.
And this is something that has been around for quite a while in terms of, I know your ambition, but was it government policy as well to have this, but it's just never quite managed to get it off the ground?
It's been an uphill struggle. The Act was 2011. I don't think it was government policy because I think moving forward with the bill was a good way of making sure that they could control the progress of it, but the fact that it's never been introduced in the last 10 years says a lot about how committed successive governments have been to this office, which has been around in the United Kingdom since 1314. So we're a little bit behind the curve on this one. And
this is perhaps as much as anything the classic situation of where we can't afford to save money.
It's always seemed like a short-sighted decision not to have this office. I'm really hopeful that we get a really good quality candidate as the first Tynwald Auditor General. They get the office set up in a couple of years, they get the staff in, they get looking at projects, and by year 3 we want them to be starting to save multiples of their salary.
And in terms of the budget then, is there a set budget that's given for this, or is this something that the new office holder will presumably plead their case to the Tynwald Management Committee or Treasury?
No, well, they will have to plead their case to Treasury, which will be an interesting discussion. But the indicative budget for the entire office is £400,000 a year. So again, we're hoping to see that 1.2 million of savings coming in after year 3. And if that doesn't work out, well, the Auditor General will be a fixed term appointment, and so if it doesn't work, then it'll be up to Tynwald to see whether they want to carry on with it.
And I know, because I've had these conversations with you in a different guise, but I know you have researched how these sorts of things work in other parliaments, and could you give some sorts of examples of the ways in which Auditor Generals in other countries potentially have saved the sorts of money that you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, some of it's looking at systems and processes, and so, for example, the Public Accounts Committee at the moment is looking at the Liverpool landing stage and how much money is being spent there, how it's gone from a supposed to be a £15 million project to a £75 million project. Well, it's taken us a year to do that. We're doing it with very little accountancy experience. You kind of got me to do that. We've got a great clerk and other members, but it's going to take a year to do that review, and I think we'll be confident in our conclusions and improvements that we would recommend. But if you've got somebody who is doing this day in, day out, you'd expect to see far more turnover of these sorts of reports that the Public Accounts Committee can then deliver to Tynwald. So it will be, should we say, sometimes a lot of the same work that you've been seeing from the PAC over recent years, but just a lot more of it, because the work that we do, I think, has been saving government money if implemented.
And I suppose therein lies the rub. Mm-hmm. There isn't any specific requirement for government, I presume, to respond to findings of the Tynwald Auditor General.
Oh no, there are requirements for the government to respond to them, and then it's up to Tynwald, of course, through the scrutiny committees to make sure that those feet are held to the fire, that the outcomes are delivered, and that's making sure that the scrutiny system, the Public Accounts Committee, are doing their job as parliamentarians, holding the government to account.
Is it? Is this new office? I mean, will they be able to consider policy? Because a lot of the issues, I suppose. I mean, you raised the one there in terms of the new landing facility at Liverpool, and these are policy driven, and presumably the Auditor General will be able to question policy as well as the finance? No,
it's not there to sort of try to undermine government's legitimate role in setting policy. What it's there to make sure is that policy being delivered in the best way, in the most value-driven economic way for the taxpayer. Now, if government policy is that we need a landing stage and we need that in Liverpool, that's one thing, but has it been delivered in the best possible way, then that's quite another. So, no, I don't expect the Auditor General to go trampling over the toes of policy, but sometimes in small jurisdictions the line between what's policy and what's delivery gets increasingly blurred, sometimes at the behest of politicians. So that's going to be an important thing to police for both government and for the Public Accounts Committee as that mediator.
Having sat on both sides of the fence, which you have, how would you be feeling in if you were still a minister and this appointment was about to be made? Would you be welcoming this with open arms, or would you have some fear and trepidation?
I should be welcoming with open arms, because this is about making sure that decisions are better made, better executed, that we're delivering value for the taxpayer, and that if there are things that aren't going well, lessons are learned from them, documented and embedded into systems and processes, not just given lip service and moved on. So I would see it as being a really valuable tool for ministers and for chief executives in making sure that government is as good as it can be.
Is it possible, though, that we are speaking hypothetically, but you raised the Liverpool landing stage there. I mean, it could well be that the Auditor General says, actually, the whole department is run on a shoestring and needs significantly more resource if it's going to take on projects like this in the future, which could actually result in the opposite of the ambition, which is to save money.
Well, the ambition isn't just to produce the same amount of government at the lowest amount of cost. It's value for money is about both value and money. It's not necessarily the cheapest answer to everything. It's about getting what you're paying for. That's the test that we're asking this person to check, because it's not just about the lowest bidder every time, because sometimes you get the lowest bidder, they haven't thought about several things and the costs pile up and the costs pile up. And the more complicated the project, the more complicated very often the solutions are, and whether they have matched the resources required to the complexity of the problem. Well, that's about, have you done the job properly? So value for money is going to be a function of that, but it's not necessarily the same amount of government at the lowest amount of cost.
Moving on then, in relation to committees, I mean, there's a little bit of a spat opened up between yourself and Laurie Hooper. Laurie suggesting that the committee system is in need of review and a degree of modernisation, and you suggesting, and I'm putting words into your mouth here, that the system is working fine and there's not a problem. How would you summarise that particular debate?
Well, I don't need to, because you decided to put words into my mouth. I don't think Laurie's sort of coming from the right place in this particular argument. I mean, he's saying that there's a lot more that needs to be opened up in terms of how the committees do their business. That's interesting compared to a lot of departments whose agendas and minutes are not published. The council ministers' proceedings are statutorily confidential. And I don't have a particular problem with that, because there needs to be a safe space for these discussions. There needs to be some discussion behind closed doors about how you formulate your policy, what it should be, and then presenting that for scrutiny, for debate in Tynwald. If that's good enough for government, then why isn't that good enough for scrutiny committees as well? That's all that the current system provides for. It's about people being able to sit down, look at what's going on, discuss it either behind closed doors as a committee, taking evidence in public very often, again, something that government isn't always hot at, and then producing a report that goes to Tynwald for scrutiny, for debate, and ultimately for vote. So I think it's very much a meeting of equals in this sort of sense. Looking back, I think the committee system has come on great strides since the early days when you and I joined Tynwald, where those days there was a constitutional committee, an economic committee, and a scrutiny committee, and there were huge areas of government that were going unscrutinised entirely. The policy of entire departments, education and home affairs would have been two examples that very rarely got looked at in any sort of detail at all. So the new system that we have, which means that departments are still shadowed by a policy review committee, and those are joined together by the Public Accounts Committee that does the value for money work and coordinates that work, is I think, a great step forward from where we were 15 years ago, and is actually starting to ask good questions, hold departments to account for the policies that they espouse.
You're listening to Speaker of the House of Keys, Juan Watterson. I recall meeting a very wise Irish politician. I think he was the equivalent of a deputy speaker in the Dáil, and I'd only been elected maybe 12 months, and I was talking about the changes that I thought were necessary, and I said perhaps I need to get a bit more experience of the system before I start on my radical reform agenda. And he turned to me and he said, no, now is the time. Once you become comfortable with the system, once you get to know the system, your desire to want to change it will diminish. So strike now while you still have the sort of the burning desire to make the change. Is it fair to say perhaps that you've just become too familiar with the structure, or do you genuinely believe that it's as good as it can be?
Well, it's worse, isn't it? If you're partially the architect of it, then you could argue that, well, if it wasn't invented here, it can't be as good. No, I'd say the time to reform a structure is as soon as you understand it. And as long as members sort of fully understand the pros and cons and that the solutions that they offer are better, then that's time for a debate. And I'm always up for making things better. The constraining factor in terms of improving the work of all of the committees of Tynwald that I've experienced has been the lack of resource and the ability to staff more committees within the same resources that we have at the moment. Once we get that sorted, if we can have an extra person here or there, then that would mean the committees could do an awful lot more, could do perhaps an awful lot better. But that's the constraining factor, and with the present economic climate, that I know would be a struggle to justify employing more people to do that.
I interviewed fairly recently Bernard Moffat, and I forget who we were referring to, but I said, they're chairing a committee onto such and such. And he rather sarcastically just said, yes, aye, they're all chairing committees up there. Just in terms of the general public, what is the value? What do we get out of the whole committee structure? I think perhaps sometimes people do have this rather derogatory and sarcastic view of the role of committees, that they're just a talking shop and nothing much gets achieved, or perhaps worse than that, they just create more and more red tape to wrap up the processes and policies of government.
Well, who knew Bernard Moffat was a cynic? But I'll just give you two examples off the top of my head. The first one was the Public Accounts Committee reports we did at the start of the last administration, which highlighted deep, significant flaws in the ability of the Department of Health and Social Care to deliver strategic change. That led to Sir Jonathan Michael coming over, doing his report. It's led to Manx Care, but it's led to a real realisation that we had to do health differently because it wasn't working for the people of this island. That, I think, is not a bad outcome for a committee. Again, the back end of the last administration, the Poverty Committee made a report, and one of the recommendations out of that was that the minimum wage should align with the living wage. The government has accepted that recommendation, meaning by the end of this administration, some 16% of the Manx workforce should no longer be living in poverty. These are the results of detailed reviews, committee reviews and reports that mean that sometimes you get more time to look at narrower subjects in more detail, with more focus, lead to good results, good recommendations that are then accepted and make a real difference to the people of this island.
And in terms of that whole committee process, is there nothing that you would like to change that you think actually maybe if we just tweaked this or introduced that, things could be improved?
There's nothing springs to mind in terms of a radical reform of the rules. What I would love to be able to do is do more reports, get them turned around faster, do more research, and that's all about having the people to do it. And don't get me wrong, the members of Tynwald that I work with, on the committees that I work with, try and put as much time as they can, but they're balancing that up against reviewing legislation, the monthly Tynwald sittings, the financial implications, the constituency work. When you do all of those things, and sometimes even trying to hold down a family life as well, when you're trying to do all of that, committees can only take so much of your time, and therein lies a few of the bottlenecks. Now, again, I think it's been improved by recognising that scrutiny committees are an important facet of that Manx constitution that we have. So PAC is carved out of that, and people are able to give that a bit more time. It tends to be that they have fewer department responsibilities as well, so they can give that bit more time, and we're seeing the results of that. But there just aren't enough hours in the day for members, there aren't enough hours in the day for the clerks. So I think for the sort of resources that we have, we provide a pretty good service to the Manx people through that committee system.
Because often another public charge that you hear from time to time is we've got far too many members. It's time we cut the numbers down. Is that a fair challenge, or I'm guessing from what you've already said, you may think that that's not an ideal thing to do?
No, I mean, whilst comparisons with the UK, perhaps not a great one at the moment. But they've got 650 people to share this workload. We're talking about 24 MHKs and another 8 MLCs who can share this burden. Now, the advantage of MLCs not having an electorate, a constituency base, does mean that they don't have that element of time that they have there, so they can offer a bit more to the committee system very often. But yeah, you've got 24 people, 9 of them are going to be in the council and ministers. You've got a speaker, you've got then the rest, and some are more engaged in the process than others. So if only it were a coalition of the willing. So perhaps there is something to be said about the way that we elect members, and we've tried to make it so that they apply, should we say, for the job, rather than just being thrown on a committee whether they're interested in it or not. I think that's a system that perhaps needs a little refinement. I don't think we're quite there yet with putting square pegs in square holes. Some committees could quite happily have sort of 4 or 5 people on them because of the sheer interest in it, and that's something that we don't accommodate at the moment. But the more people you have, the harder it is to schedule meetings. So again, you have these tensions and balances that are sort of built into the system, but it will be what members want it to be at the end of the day.
And in terms of resource, I mean, one of the obvious things that would be helpful, I presume, to Tynwald members is having a good research department, and certainly when I was first elected back in 2003, the Clerk of Tynwald's office was reasonably well funded in that regard, but it has suffered over the I suppose it's nearly 20 years since then, in terms of having limited budgets.
Yeah, and we haven't applied for budget increases for the last, since I've been Speaker, certainly, just because the fact that when times are tough, there's not an awful lot of people going to support putting money into Parliament as opposed to putting it into health and education and police and all the other things that people seem to value higher. Don't get me wrong, the value of Parliament is immense, but it's not always immediately seen by the public, and that then comes through in those budget bids. So we haven't gone down that road of asking for more resources. We have, however, had increasing demands put on the office. There are only 22 staff in the Clerk of Tynwald's office, and when you compare that with the 8,000 around the public service, that's a very small proportion of it, and yet they have to do everything from Hansard research, engagement, clerking committees, the sittings of House of Keys, Legislative Council and Tynwald, and there's an awful lot of work in doing all that, and an increasing expectation of members around engagement, around reaching out to the public about explaining who we are and what we're doing, as well as bringing people in to the island to see that, and all of this takes time, energy and effort. And I have to say, the staff of the Clerk of Tynwald's office are fantastic public servants in delivering that. They never cease to go above and beyond, but we do it within the constraints we have.
And final question, I suppose, is it how do we get over, or how do you, as particularly in your role as Speaker, how do you get over to the public the importance and value of the work that happens in the various branches of Tynwald?
I think it's about sort of joining those dots that people don't always see. So when I said about Manx care and the changes that are needed, the things that are going on around legislation around the complaints system and improving health services, you've got to draw those dots back to actually what triggered that. And actually what triggered that was a Public Accounts Committee report. When people are starting to see real increases in their wage packets, who are on minimum wage and are seeing those go up by more than inflation, when you track that back, it was the Select Committee of Poverty that recommended that, and that's the trigger for that sort of action. So if you track things back and you join those dots, that's where I think Tynwald's going to get its credibility for making real changes in the lives of people, with the assistance of government, through Tynwald as a body, but that's where social change is going to come from on this island.
That was Speaker of the House of Keys, Juan Watterson. Are you convinced by his arguments? Do we underestimate the value of committees, or are they just hot air and nonsense? Let me know what you think by contacting Phil Gawne at manxradio.com, and get in touch if you have any ideas for future programmes. Don't forget, this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. For now though, I'm Phil Gawne. Goramayo. Thanks for listening.